Good day, everybody. My name is Bruce Elgort from OpenNTF, and I am here today to host the third OpenNTF webinar with three gentlemen who have created a brilliant project on OpenNTF. In fact, it's just won the Appathon development contest that was just held. And the name of the project is the OpenNTF Domino API. Okay, but before I introduce these gentlemen, I just want to remind you that you can find past webinars and learn about upcoming webinars at webinars.openntf.org. That's webinars.openntf.org that you see at the bottom of the screen there. And you can also visit the OpenNTF YouTube channel at youtube.com/OpenNTF. So without further ado, let's introduce today's speakers very quickly because they have some great stuff to share with you. The first speaker that you're going to hear from is Nathan Freeman, who's the Chief Software Architect at Red Pill Development. And the next speaker is Paul Withers, who's also the co-author of the XPages extension library. And last but not least and not forgotten is the Jesse Gallagher, who's the CTO of I Know Some Guys, one of my favorite company names of all time. In fact, I would love to have a band by that name. So without any further ado, as I said before, I'm going to turn it over to Nathan to get you guys started on the OpenNTF Domino API. Nathan.
Yes, thank you, Bruce. Bruce, can you confirm that people can hear me okay? Bruce, can you hear me? Hello, Bruce.
Yes, Nathan, I can hear you. Sorry about that. I had muted myself.
Well, that was embarrassing.
It's okay. Take her away, my friend.
Well, what a great kickoff to our webinar, which, these things always start with me in a fit of panic and absolute mortal terror as we try to get things rolling. We're here today to talk about the OpenNTF Domino API, and in order to understand what its mission is, we have to take a look back at the Lotus Domino Java API. So we're going to start today with a bit of a review so you'll understand our motivations. The Lotus Domino API is the core Java API provided by IBM, and it's the most used API in XPages and XPages development. Even if you're writing all your code in SSJS, it's just Java underneath the covers. So this is our legal disclaimer. You'll be able to pick up these slides. I'm sure it'll be somewhere on the webinar site. Bruce will be able to direct us on where they'll come from so you can read this in detail later. So a little bit about the details of the Java API. You can run the Java API in a number of places, in agents and applets, servlets, XPages plugins, XPages templates. And of course, from that API is how you access your various databases, documents, views, etc. If you want complete details on that, you can check out the IBM Domino Designer help. And a little history of that API. It started in 1996 as Lotus.Note, which was very, very broken on the JVM 1.0. And when Release 5 came out, we got the Lotus.Domino API, and that was written on the 1.1 version of the JVM. And then, of course, over the next 10 years, we saw some revisions come from IBM, primarily in the form of which version of the JVM was supported. We didn't really get any new APIs until around 2007, when with Notes 8, we saw the com.ibm.notes package come out. That did some automated tracking of a little bit of metadata and introduced a few UI calls, not really that much. And then, of course, with 8.5, we saw the rise of DDE and the XSP, XPages API, and that's when things really started to explode for Java on the platform. That Java program cost $20 million per year. That has nothing to do with reality. It's there as a joke. If you don't get it, Google Edward Snowden, and then this will all make sense. So today we're introducing the OpenNTF Domino API. And this API is the fastest way to deliver productivity. and Domino. Our objective is all about making developers more productive, allowing you to get things done faster, more reliably, and really making your code flow. So how do we do that? Well, there's 6 keys in the current milestones to get that done. The first is that we provide inline documentation, so you get proper Java documentation support in your IDE. We automate garbage collection. So for those of you who are transitioning from a LotusScript background, you may have encountered this incredibly bizarre, very annoying phenomenon called recycle. And you're constantly going, why do I have to know what to recycle when? And I have to keep track of all this stuff. And if I'm walking over a document collection, I have to recycle in reverse order and reassign my variables. And it's incredibly annoying and very unproductive. And the OpenNTF Domino API eliminates that for you. We also introduced auto logging, which means that you can get rid of constantly having to write try-catch blocks for everything you want to do. We have automatic catching for all exceptions that occur to try to simplify the process. Auto boxing, and what that really means is whenever you want to write things into, or read or write things in and out of your notes database, you don't have to cast your data to match all the exact nuances of IBM's API. So for those of you that have been working with Java for a while, you probably know that Java has a native notion of dates, and you cannot assign one of those dates into a notes field. You first have to convert it into a date time within the Lotus Domino API. That's one of the things we take away. We automate the transition from one data type to another. So you can do things like, oh, I have a string array. I don't actually have to put that into a vector in order to actually assign it to a field. So some really great productivity gains from that. We've also introduced the concept of iterables, always a word I have a little trouble saying. Basically here, this means you can do for each loops on the pieces of the collection pieces of the API. So if you have a view entry collection or a document collection, rather than having to write your own looping structure, you can just say for view entry in view.getAllEntries, and it'll automatically iterate over them for you. This is a really great help because it's so easy for people to inadvertently write infinite loops. That problem goes away. You won't be writing any more accidental infinite loops as you forget to transition to the next element of your collection. And it makes the complicated recycle management that has to happen within those manual loops go away. And the fourth thing is the helper classes. These are various ways that we just make a lot of common tasks simpler. I'll show you some examples of those shortly. In fact, I will transition right now to some code. By the way, I can't see the regular screen with the chat, so if there is chat going on that anybody needs to draw my attention to, I hope that Bruce or Paul or one of my other colleagues will interrupt my audio and tell me that I need to pay attention to something.
Yeah, Nathan,
okay.
I just posted in the webinar chat that if you have questions, post them in the chat, and we're going to have a Q&A session. That's where Jesse comes in at the end, as well as Nathan and Paul. But post them there, and I'll record them, and we'll get them answered later. Thanks, Nathan.
Thanks, Bruce. Okay, so I just wanted to take some time and look at a few code samples so that you can see the difference in productivity that you get out of using the API. So on my screen now, and I'll maximize this a little bit here. So here is a method called processViewOld, and it's just an example of how you might take the contents of a view and walk over all the entries that exist in the view and perform some task on them. Right? This is a fairly common type of pattern that you encounter in the Domino world. And so if you want to do this properly, obviously you have to structure your variables to start with, and then enter into a try block, right? Because everything throws a notes exception. Enter into a try block to start iterating over your contents, and of course that's going to have a catch and then a finally where you manage the recycle of the things that you created at the top. And once you're inside your try block, you have to tell the view not to update the collection underneath you. You get the collection, you start with the first entry, and you monitor to see if you've gotten to the null, which tells you you're at the end of the list, and you assign a temporary variable to the next entry and go through and actually do your thing in the one line here. That's actually what we're trying to accomplish. So out of this entire method, only one line is the thing that we actually wanted to do. That's right here. And all the rest of this is framing so that we can adhere to the API, so that we can handle our exceptions, so that we can manage our recycles and deal with all the other vagaries of the API. So in the OpenNTF API, that looks like this. Right? It's 3 lines. And it's 3 lines that look like all the other Java you ever see in the world. Because recycle is handled because not everything throws an exception, and you don't constantly have to manage try-catch blocks. You can just get right to the meat of what it is you want to do, and you can say, for all the entries in this view, I want to do something. So you can get right to whatever it is you want to get done. And so here we're seeing the advantages of the auto logging, the garbage collection, and the iterator capabilities. So hopefully right now, if you've been a Java programmer in Domino, you're looking at that going, oh man, that looks really, really nice, because we worked hard to make it so. So auto boxing. Here's an example of wanting to get a Java date from a date field in a document. Right? So we passed in the document, and we want to get access to a field called process date. And if we do this properly, if we actually do all of our defensive coding for this particular operation, then there's a lot of stuff we have to do. Right? First, again, in our try-catch block, we're going to have to check to see if we already have the item. If we don't have the item, then if we call a getItemValue, we're going to get an empty string, which we don't want because we want to make sure we have a date. So then when we actually get the item value, that's going to come back as a vector. The vector, of course, is untyped because this is based on the Java 1.1 API, which is before Java supported generics. We have to check to see if it's null or if it's empty to make sure it actually has some values before we actually get the first one. Then we have to make sure we didn't get a null value out of that. And then we have to make sure it's actually a date time because that's what we wanted. And then we have to wrap in another try-catch the effort to get the Java date out of that date time with another recycle call at the end of that. And if you're wondering why this isn't a try-catch, it's because it's possible for the date time to come back out of the field and not be valid for conversion to a Java date. So for example, you can have a Lotus date time that is set to any date, any time, which is basically a blank time. You can't convert that to a Java date or throw an exception. And you have to make sure you recycle it, even if it did throw an exception. So again, look how deep this goes. I mean, this is kind of crazy, right? That's a lot of work just to get a date field get a date out of a field. In the OpenNTF version of the API, it looks like this. Right? You just say get item value, and oh, by the way, I'm expecting to get a date back. And then it automatically converts everything it needs to convert in order to have the date. Somewhere out there in webinar land, I hope some people are cheering. Okay, so the next example is when we actually want to write a date back into the field. Now this, again, gets fairly complicated, right? If we have a document and a Java date, then actually getting that into a field is a bit involved. We have to, from the document, climb up the tree and get the parent so that we can get a session, so that from the date we can create a date time off the session, which then gives us the ability to actually assign that into a field. As you can see here, if you're actually trying to deal with a list of dates, it would just be crazy what you had to do to get that done. And so we use our standard pattern where we have our database and our session at the top, and we go through the assignment of them and everything, and we catch that, and then best practice again, we use a finally block to handle our recycles, and we recycle the database and the session, except, oh wait, that would be really, really bad. If we actually did it this way, that would be really bad. We would destroy our database and destroy our session while we were in the middle of this operation. So not only do we have to apply the best practice of knowing how to do our try and catch and finally and managing our recycle, but we have to know when not to do it too. So you can't just apply the pattern universally. the pattern only applies in some certain cases, and in other cases it becomes very toxic. So again, we just turned around and made that really simple. It's doc.replace item value, and you can give it a date. And if you have a list of dates instead, that's no problem. Doc.replace item value, here's a list of dates. And then one of the really cool things that the API does, for that final example down there, is you have a hash map of strings and dates. And if you have that map and you'd like to assign that to a field, no problem. Just hand the map to replace item value, and it will automatically serialize it into a byte stream, compress it, and store it as a MIME attachment in that particular field. And you can do this for any level of complexity. We've had images stored directly this way, maps of maps of maps. We've stored custom Java objects, all kinds of ways that you can just cram whatever data you want into any given field. Okay, so a little bit about the helper classes that we have now. One nice capability is that you can treat any document as according to the Java Maps interface. So a document is now implements the Java Map interface, and you can do get, put, clear, size, as you see in some of these examples. Get, of course, says, okay, well, if you do get with a string, you're going to get whatever value is in the item for that name. But one of the cool things we just added that'll be in the next milestone release is if you pass it instead a formula, it'll just evaluate that formula against the document. So you can treat the formula itself as a key in the map and get it evaluated and executed against the document. Among the other helpers, we have something called a document scanner. That builds a list of all the string tokens that exist within a document. So you can basically just give it an entire document collection if you want, and tell it to process each of the documents. And you can see here we're demonstrating the use of an iteratable for that, where we get all the documents and pass them into the scanner. And then at the end, we ask the scanner, well, what did you get for all the fields for the values inside this particular set of documents? This is great for external term matching or for predictive type ahead. If you use the type ahead controls in, say, full text searching, you don't have any way in the regular Domino API to find out what terms are in your full text index, so you can use a document scanner to build the list of terms that exist within the entire database. Another common pattern that we support here is syncing documents in different databases. I would say raise your hand if you've done this before, but everybody will raise their hand. We've all done this before. This is a staple of notes development. You have some data in one set of documents, and there's fields on those documents that you have to match to another set of documents because you want to be able to show them in a view. And so everybody has their own pattern of how they write this, and there's mountains and mountains of code to manage this kind of synchronization. So in our API, we introduced just one way to do it. There's a sync helper, and you give it some rules, and it handles everything else you need to do. So you see in this case, we build a map of strings to strings with the source field and the target field. We apply a strategy to the syncer. There's create and replace, there's replace only if new. We set up the target information for how we're going to match the documents in the target database, and then we tell it to process the collection. And there's some enhancements coming to this in the next milestone where things are simpler. So now all of the custom code that you have floating around that you have to worry about transitioning and testing, and you probably have it in LotusScript, and you go, wow, it's 10,000 lines of LotusScript that I use to manage the synchronization between my databases. I don't want to have to port all that to Java. Well, okay, you don't. You could just use this API, and this helper class is provided automatically for you. It actually, in M3, it will even support transactional boundaries. So that's kind of cool. You can actually tell it you don't want to commit any of the changes until it's done with all of them. So that's a pretty big time saver as far as we're concerned. Okay, so those are the key things that we did to help make developers more productive, and to talk about how to actually use it, I'm going to turn things over to my friend Paul Withers. Wow, the line just got very quiet. Okay. No.
Hi, Nathan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Ah.
And Paul, I've set you to the presenter.
Okay, so I'll just share my screen. Okay, so there's a number of steps involved in installing the API. I was just switching, Nathan, so I'm not sure how much of that you explained.
I didn't explain anything about how to install it yet.
Oh, okay.
I've left that all to you.
Right. So the first step is that we've got to have the jar file on the server. So in our Domino server, that's put in JVM, lib, and ext, and it's alongside the notes jar, and here it is on the server there. So that makes it available.
Paul, I can't see your screen. I don't know whether anyone else can, but it's not coming through on my presentation.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Other people are seeing it. Okay, so
yep.
Yes. All right.
I can see Paul's screen. He's got the Windows Explorer up with org.opentf.domino.jar.
I fixed it. I'm an idiot. Please proceed, Paul. Sorry for interrupting.
That's fine. So I've kept the jar here because deleting jars from the Domino server whilst it's up is a bit of a pain. But that will make it available. Nathan, can you just correct me? That will make it available for Java agents, any Java applets or servlets, OSGI plugins, but not XPages. Is that correct?
Well, it's sort of correct. It won't automatically be in XPages, but the API is accessible from XPages once you've dropped it into that library. The additional support plugins are so that it will be automatically hoisted into your XPages template context. But It's always there to call. Once you put it into that libx folder, it's part of the JVM. For if you do it on a server, it's for the entire server. So whether you're dealing with dots or a template or an agent or an applet or a servlet, whatever it is you're dealing with, once you've dropped it in there, it's available.
Right. As it is with that, if I try to go to an XPage that relies upon it, then you can see that it throws the exception, and that's our usual one. If we go to our data, IBM technical support, and our XPages exception text file, then it's saying that it can't find the library that it depends upon. So the easiest way to provision that is with an update site. So I've got my update site template here, and I always use a separate one for separate lots of plugins, because you can only delete all content. You can't delete an individual plugin. So this makes it easier to replace. So I just select the site.xml, run it, and we can see that it's in there and it's ticked that it's accepted. Then all we have to do is restart the HTTP task. Restart task HTTP is the one to use for anything to do with XPages, because that will completely reload the JVM. And we can just do a check that it's there, and we can see that it's lazy loaded. And now if we go to that page, then we can see that it comes up okay. So that's installed it in on the server. If I go to the database, you can see that I've still got an error there, because it's missing that required library, even though it's on the server. I also need to add it into my Notes client installation. So first step again is copying the jar, and if I go to my notes client installation, and it's exactly the same place, JVM, lib, ext, and paste it in there. And again, I need to install the update site again. So I've got it pre-selected here. We just select the update site, accept the license, say yes, we want to install the plugin, and then restart. So it's just a couple of steps really for installing it in on the server and on the client, and that's then available in Designer as well. So whilst that just loads up, we've got some examples here. So for exceptions, we're not only logging them to the console and to a text file, as you see with that error 500 that we had, for example, for normal XPages errors, we're also logging it to OpenLog as well. So if I generate this error, then we can see it's done. If we go to the console, then we can say it's saying here is an error. If I go to that IBM technical support folder, which any XPage developer is probably very familiar with, then we can see that rather than logging it to the XPages_exe file, we're using a separate org.OpenNTF.log file, and it's logged there along with the stack trace. That's called from server-side JavaScript there. We've also got a Java one, and that's getting logged here, and we can see that there's a much more extensive stack trace, including the line in the Java method in the database that's being called.
One of the important things to understand here, if you're wondering why we're logging to this separate file, is by default error messages that come from XPages. First off, what you see on the console says to go look at an XML file, which if you've ever actually gone to look at that XML file, you'll discover is really hard to read. Usually because the XML itself isn't closed at the end of the file until you've shut down the web server. So to look at the log, you actually have to shut down the web server. Not a good solution. So the other reason is that we wanted to separate out exceptions that are happening from our API from exceptions that might be happening from everything else going on in XPages. So if there's something that's happening at our layer that we're managing the log export for, you can specifically see these files in that technical support folder.
One of the other benefits that I can show now that Designer is back up and running is that even in server-side JavaScript, we've got type ahead support. Now, we've got all of the normal methods that you would expect with adjust date, but we've also got some new methods there: equals ignore date, equals ignore time, is after, is before. So we've got all of those methods available with type ahead once you cast it as the org.OpenNTF.Domino version. And that's also available in Java. So if I go to the datetime bean, then then we've also got those that type ahead there, and we've got links across to the actual Java docs for it. One of the other very nice things is that we're actually getting some more useful variables that are being passed in as parameters. So,
including this misspelled version of compare date.
No, it was supposed to be compare date.
Oh, it is?
Yes. But particularly if you're used to the traditional Lotus.Domino arguments, then you'll see arg0, arg1. Because of the way that that's all built up, we've gone through and added more human readable variables into there. So we've got the demo database. So for most of these, we've got a server-side JavaScript tests that can be run. So this is using Nathan's code for looking over a view and printing out all of the note IDs. And we've also got the Java that does the same. But then for many of the pages, we've got a Java comparator tab. So that shows the standard code and the org.OpenNTF code. So as you can see, that's considerably shorter. And we're then showing it side by side, comparing what has been added in green, what has been removed in red, and the lines that are the same. So there's quite a lot of code there that's being stripped out. And just looking at the date field comparison, there again is the comparison of the code and what is there and what's stripped out. So as we go along, this database will be expanded to cover examples for all the various methods. But that's some nice, useful comparisons there.
I want to draw the audience's attention to the demos using datetime. There's a reason why we're using datetime for all of these. First off, it was dealing with date times was the inspiration for this entire project because they're so challenging to get right. And what people a lot of times don't realize is just how tricky and dangerous they can be. So if you, when you have a date time object in the API, that is linked not to a document or to a database, but it's linked to the session. It's parented to the session. And so if you, for any reason, fail to recycle that date time, it exists for as long as your session exists. So if you're running a fairly complex agent that's looking at multiple databases, even if you think you're being very diligent about your recycles, if you're handling date times at all, it's possible to leave a really vital link, a really vital leak, rather, open without realizing it. And this can happen in places where you didn't even realize it's going on. So if you do if you have a notes view entry and you say .get column values, and you get all the column values that exist for a view entry, if one of those columns has an @ created, then there's a date time. You might not ever even read that particular column, but it exists in the vector that gets returned, and it's parented to your session. So even though you never touched that particular piece of data, the outstanding handle is still there, and you have a great big leak, and that eventually leads to your program crashing, or in some more dramatic scenarios, your server crashing. So this is one of the big motives we had to do this entire project at all, was just handling these things. It's just so toxic that we just wanted to find a way to get it done once the right way and put it behind us forever. So that's one of the key objectives to this overall project. Thanks for letting me interrupt, Paul.
No, that's fine. And one of the bits that I added in because I could and because it was easier was checking whether a date is before or after, because that's easy in Java, but not so easy with the date-time object. You can use time difference, or what you should use rather is time difference double, because sooner or later, if you're comparing large dates, then there might be a difference that actually needs to be a double. But I always get confused about which way round those go. So just having an is before or is after certainly makes it a lot easier for me. So I think that's everything on the demo side for that. Was there anything else you wanted me to cover, Nathan?
Paul, you didn't mention the logging into OpenLog.
Oh, right. Yes. Let me just find.
So while Paul's setting that up, one of the key things that we did with the API is when the original Lotus Domino API was created, Java did not have an abstract notion of logging. That wasn't introduced, I think, until Java 1.3, maybe 1.2, I'm not sure. But the Java util logging API was introduced well after the original Lotus Domino API was established, so it was never incorporated into what the underlying API did. So kind of the only thing you could do with exceptions was to print stack traces and just dump things out and never really process any of your exceptions unless you built a whole lot of framing code for that. What we've done instead now is there are log management rules that you can set up through various properties or various any settings that will ultimately tell the underlying API how to manage any logging or exceptions that it does. And we have a couple of examples baked directly into the API, including the OpenNTF project OpenLog. And Paul has put that together, and he can show you some of the examples here.
Yes, so these are those errors that we had earlier that were being printed to the console, and the stack trace was being pushed out into into the text file. We've also got them being logged into OpenLog. So if you use that and want to be notified about them, then you don't necessarily need to go all the way down into that text file. You can find them here with all that stack trace as well. And this is implemented, as Nathan said, as a logger. There are a few problems with actually creating the logger in XPages because of security exceptions. So what there is at the moment to use those is, if I just go to that error method. Let's just go to the exception page and look at it in server-side JavaScript. That's going to be easier. So Domino Utils has a handle exception method which takes a throwable, and that will write it out to the console, to the to that text file, and also to OpenLog. And there are some xsp.properties to define the location of those of that file as well. Nathan, with the work that you've done on setting up different running under different authority, will that now work from XPages, do you think?
It has in my testing.
Right.
So what happens is this is one of the reasons why our install strategy is to take the fundamental jar and put it into the libx folder in your JVM. Is because when you do that, you are getting underneath the security management that comes with XPages later. So you're running at a lower level in the API, you're running at a lower level in the security management. So you don't have to deal with as much Java policy changes or run into problems where you're trying to do access privilege calls and that sort of thing. That's already handled within our API. So it's one of the advantages to running out of that install location. So a couple of people in the chat have asked, well, can I just put this into my NSF? And the answer is yes, you can do that. You can take the whole API and just put it as a resource, as a library resource within your template. But there are some things that you then won't be able to do. And some of these logging capabilities are good examples of where you'll lose some power for that. That's really why we recommend dropping it directly in the folder.
And at the moment, previously when we were working on Milestone 1, I had problems actually initiating a logger from XPages because those are all secure methods. Even calling a method that was in the jar file, I was having problems with. But I think you've done some work on access security.
Yeah, I did quite a bit of work. I did quite a bit of work to make sure that your stuff was working okay. So I think it's pretty good now. I have the other members of the team have been using the API in a lot of test modes. Red Pill has been fortunate enough that we actually have a customer that is running it now in staging and is preparing to roll it out into production. So that's pretty exciting. So we actually are working with them on processing entire domains worth of NSF. And I think one of the test runs I did the other day, we were processing their environment, got to the end, and it reports when you use some of the threading capabilities that exist within the API. When it's done, it reports how much stuff was handled automatically through the auto recycling garbage collection, and it was over 7 million handles. So got to the end and said, hey, I had 7 million Lotus Domino objects over the course of this that I dealt with auto recycling, and you never had to worry about that in the first place. It was just
20. Yeah, and 20,000 would usually crash a server if you had 20,000 open.
I think it got up to around 150,000 on some platforms.
Nathan, you mentioned before, sorry for interrupting, some of the other developers on the team, and I forgot to mention that and discuss that in the beginning. So could you take a moment just to go over who was involved with the project and what role they played?
You want me to share credit? Yeah, we have some guys that have worked on this project who aren't on the call, but are listed on the project page and have made some great contributions. Renee Winkelmeyer is one of them. You guys might know him from the File Navigator project on OpenNTF. He did a lot of the original templating work on the various class wrappers that we have in the API. Tim Tripconi, who contributed all of the iteratable code, or at least most of it. I think somebody else did one of the iterators. And Declan Lynch, who has been a huge help with all the documentation. He was a big participant in the renaming of all the argument names, all the parameter names to the various methods, so that you can actually read them when you get type ahead in the IDE. So he was responsible for a lot of that, and he supports all the Java doc that's built right into the API, so that you can see it in the IDE. Paul, if you can turn things back over to me, I do have a little bit more to show. And here we go. So Paul's told us how to get the install done. One thing that he didn't mention is the GitHub site. So if you're the kind of person like me who really likes to look at source code, you can go to GitHub and go to our repository, which is under the OpenNTF general repository, and it's org.opentf.domino. And you can see all the source code there, all the documentation that's built in, our test cases, and so forth. And if you're a Java developer who's worked with the Lotus Domino API, you should go look at it. There's some clever bits. There's some hacks. There's a lot of tedious code in there, but there's some really cool stuff that I think a lot of people would learn a lot. I know that I have every time I look at more of Jesse or Tim's code or Paul's code. I learn a little bit more about how to make things right in Java. So what's in the plan for the future? Right, we're not done. We just did a small update yesterday called Milestone 2.5C. That fixed a little thing on the update site, but we're going to keep going. We have a Milestone 3 release that's coming up soon, and we're going to keep fleshing out the capabilities that we've done so far. So we have the graph database capabilities built right in, so you can use an NSF as a graph. If you don't know what a graph database is, you can Google it. I highly recommend them. They're really cool. We're going to do more with design elements. I'll have Jesse talk about that in just a moment. I'm working on a piece for data schemas for the API. I'm really excited about this part. Basically, you can say, for this NSF, I have this kind of record. I have a contact record, and it's going to have a first name, a last name, an address, a city, state, and zip. And when you structure that in the schema, at the bottom level of the API, you can do all of your validation. So you can say, I want to make a new contact. It's already pre-populated with those items. If you try to save, you can have validation rules for those items, and those are happening at the lowest level of the API. So that it's effectively, you're turning the NSF into a system with built-in business rules. I'm very excited about that. I think there's going to be some great innovations that come out of that capability. So I'm really looking forward to finishing that work. We're going to do some deeper things with jobs and tasks and concurrency and multi-threading. There's already some pieces in place for that. There is a specific kind of thread that you run called a domino thread. We're going to carry this stuff further out. We're also tinkering around with some big data models. This is one of the long-standing limitations of the API and the platform, is that it's very single database centric. So we're looking to do some things where you would say, no, I want to have this spread over a whole collection of NSFs and be able to do interesting and innovative things because you're dealing with multiple NSFs at once. And we're going to do more XPages stuff. There's going to be, right now, the support plugin for XPages gives you SSJS access to the variables and allows you to set some settings to cause the session and database implicit variables in XPages to be reassigned to our versions of those objects rather than the Lotus.domino versions of those objects. We're going to get even further into it. We're going to do more interesting bits. We'll probably have some components thrown in. We might even do our own version of data sources at some point, so that we can have things like graph data sources in XPages. Jesse, you want to talk a little bit about the data schema stuff? I'm sorry, the design element stuff? Look, I'm so obsessed. I can't even refer to your part of the project correctly.
I don't have slides for this, so it'll be pretty quick before Q&A. But one of my big projects lately has been working on a new design API, kind of separate from the standard one. Because over the years I've done a whole lot with DXL. Like I have the whole forms and views project, and I've done a lot of those other things. And I really just want to make it a lot easier and stop having to reinvent the wheel when I want to do design manipulation beyond the confines of the standard. You can do some stuff with views and you can do some stuff with outlines, but that's basically it with the standard API. So I've been working on a set of classes that really expose pretty much everything you'd want to do with forms, views, and more importantly, things like file resources that you can't normally really get to very well. And so I want to make it so that you can deal with pretty much everything, barring XPages because they're trouble, unfortunately. Pretty much everything else in an NSF in a very nice programmatic way with a good API, so that you don't always have to do DXL, and especially with some of the elements where DXL does not necessarily work because it just spits out binary rich text data. That's stuff that I'm dealing with in the API, and I'm really looking forward to putting some more work into that so that you'll have a lot more ability to treat data in it. You'll have data being able to be treated in interesting ways like graph databases and things like that. And then on the other side, you'll also have this new interesting view into the design of the database, such that it'll be a lot easier to, for one, not use Designer. to deal with a lot of this stuff. And I think that'll open up a lot of interesting possibilities. I think that's it before we can move on to the Q&A.
Yes, it is. Thanks, Jesse, and thanks everybody for coming. And I hope some people have some good questions for us now.
Right. So if you do have any questions, what you need to do is press *6 on your telephone or whatever you're using to participate on this call. Unmute yourself. Don't all jump in at one time. Or you can post something in the chat and we'll read it aloud for Paul, Nathan, or Jesse to answer. So fire away, everybody. Oh, come on. Someone has to challenge these three. I do have to say that a lot of questions that were asked during the webinar were in fact answered by Jesse, Paul, and Nathan during the webinar. So, no questions?
What I will say, I think David Leedy mentioned about dropping it into an NSF rather than sticking it on the server for a start. If you stick it on the server, then it's not going to impact any other databases on that server. I've had it installed on my local server, and then you can still access the org.OpenNTF Domino classes using the open session and open database variables. So to create the session in Java, for example, I've used xlib.resolve variable and then resolved a variable open session to get a handle on that org.OpenNTF.session, and then you can easily just push it down and use it throughout the rest of the application.
Yeah, and David Leedy just posted something in the chat that says most people might have a tough time convincing their admins to put this on the server. So I think NSF installs are important. So that's a little more justification there.
Let me ask the people in the chat then, and you can do this by a show of hands, or you can all just sort of spam into the chat window. What would people think about something that did an auto install of the API, a bit like the update site-based OSGI plugins for XPages? So as Paul showed earlier, he has the update site NSF, and then he's configured that NSF to be the source of his plugin. If we did something similar to that actually managed the core jar file on the server, would that be something that people would want to see?
You do have a woohoo from somebody, and that's what I think from the same somebody. So,
yeah, the slight difference over the normal update site is that with the extension library, it's only putting the those relevant XSPs, those relevant jars in memory for the HTTP session to access. We need to also put that jar physically on the server, but there are certainly ways to do that.
Okay, there are two other things that popped up. Eric Schmidt had a question. Can I push the install to my designer clients using the strategy, like for extension library, widget, etc., widgets through policies?
Yes.
Although, would that work for pushing the jar file, Nathan, as well?
No, it won't work. It won't work for pushing the jar file. It'll just work for the support plugin for the XSP layer. We'd have to write something additional in order to deal with it if you wanted to distribute that way. If this kind of auto install is really important to people, then what would be great is if people put it as a feature request in GitHub, so that we can track it. And if it's really important for people, then we'll solve it. We're all about serving our customer audience.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions for Paul Withers, Nathan Freeman, or that guy, Jesse Gallagher?
Hey, Bruce,
Go ahead, sorry.
This is Howard Greenberg. I had a question, I guess just wondering about the participation or lack of participation by IBM, and you guys did a great job. And I'm sure a lot of us, are going to jump on this, but there's a lot of companies that, when they look at open source or something kind of like this, that without the IBM support, they're going to not allow it. And I don't know if you guys have had any conversations with IBM. Are they totally not interested or semi-interested? Or
Well, okay, so let me give you a few thoughts on that by way of a story. The other day, Devin Olson was sharing with some folks in a chat room about some frustrations he had encountered with the default convert to MIME behavior of the Java API. So if it finds a MIME item and you just read it out like any regular old item, it automatically converts it to rich text by default. And so he was complaining about this in a chat room. And 4 minutes later, I was checking in code that allowed you to set a parameter in XSP properties that would flip the default behavior so that it wouldn't convert MIME automatically. So 4 minutes from his original observation of the problem, he had access to a solution. Now, if you went to IBM and complained about this, let's say you actually went through the process. So he calls IBM support, and he tries to open a PMR, and he's going to argue with some guy on the support call, but maybe he gets lucky and he actually opens a PMR, and then maybe he tells his friends that he's opened a PMR, and they all decide, this miracle occurs, and they all decide to also call support and complain about the same thing. Maybe that might get elevated to an SPR that would actually end up on a triage list for product management. And then they might decide whether or not they're going to do it. They would ask engineering how they should implement it, and engineering would debate and hem and haw about how they would go about doing such a thing and where they'd put the switch and how it would behave and what about this scenario and what about backwards compatibility and blah, 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 blah. And then maybe it might actually make it into the code, and you'd have a beta version, and then that beta version would go through testing for 6 months, 9 months, a year, and then it might eventually get released. And because Devin works for Declan Lynch, he might actually get the gold code installed on a server sometime within this century, but for most organizations, it's going to be another year, 2 years, 3 years down the road before they actually get it installed and deployed. So if you want to worry about support from IBM, then you can get your problem solved in a time span measured in years or decades. If you want to get your problem solved now, then work with open source and stop worried about whether or not you can file a PMR. Calling support is just silly. I don't know why anybody does this in modern software. It's just utterly useless. You don't get anything out of it, especially for developers. I mean, maybe if you're an admin and you're running a mail server, it kind of makes sense. But when you're dealing with writing your own software, it's just crazy to worry about whether or not IBM supports something. Go out and get the source code for things that you can use and solve your problems now. Okay, end of rant.
All right.
In actual answer to your question, Howard, IBM is well aware of what we're doing. Some of their engineers have taken a look at the code. They had to wait until we had full Apache clearance to be able to look at everything, so it's been fairly recent for them. Yeah,
and I'm going to ask this final question. Oliver Busey had a question about documentation. Can you explain, guys, where to find it? And I think Paul did answer it in the chat, but just for the audio here.
It is built into the jar itself. There is a doc folder that has all of the HTML for the Java doc. And I was looking for this yesterday. I know that Declan hosts a copy of all of that generated doc on his web domain, but I don't know the URL. We will put the URL into the GitHub wiki for the project. It's just as soon as I get a hold of Declan and find out what the address is. But we'll get that done and make sure that people can find the online version of it. But all of the doc files, all the HTML files for the documentation are built directly into the jar as well. You just open it up with a zip, like a zip file, and the doc's right in there.
And as Paul just pointed out in the chat, and we're going to close after this, is that you can find it on GitHub too. So if you go to github.com/OpenNTF and then you find the org.OpenNTF.Domino API project, you can find it there as well. All right. Wow, you guys have done an amazing job, as well as the rest of the team that's not on the call today. So again, I want to congratulate you guys and the team on winning the Apathon and for presenting on the third OpenNTF webinar. So with that, we're going to adjourn the webinar for the day, and we'll post this on YouTube so you guys can watch this in the comfort of your own home, office, or shed, wherever you're living or working. So thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming.